is also one of my big jobs. Part of that will be introducing legislation that when police make arrests, they can have some certainty that work is going to be respected throughout our public safety ecosystem. It's also going to let us get back on track to get to 4,000 officers. And it's also going to make it possible for me to recruit the next great police chief of the Metropolitan Police Department.
So I take it from your statement that you are very critical of Mr. Graves' decision to decline the prosecution of 67% of arrests. Is that accurate?
I want to make sure that all of the work of our Metropolitan Police, all of the bravery of people who come forward as witnesses is carefully considered as cases move through the criminal justice system.
Mr. Graves, you heard it. That sounds like very carefully worded criticism, but criticism nonetheless. For you, Mr. Graves, Chief Contee postulates that the average homicide suspect has been arrested 11 times prior to committing homicide. We're 136 days into 2023, and there's already been 80 homicides in D.C. this year. That's 5 more than all of 2022, and on pace for approximately 215 homicides in 2023. Mr. Graves, your policies are directly endangering the public. In how many instances have you declined to prosecute someone who was eventually charged with homicide?
So, thank you for the question. As a career prosecutor, nothing is of greater concern to me than community safety.
No, Mr. Graves, I appreciate that, and I appreciate you thanking me for the question. I would love to thank you for a direct answer. How many have ended in homicide that you did not prosecute?
So the statistic you cite of 67% is a snapshot in time of what the office looked like when I came into the role. From day one, actually before day one, I sat down with Chief Contee.
Don't quibble, Mr. Graves, don't quibble with that statistic. Just answer this direct question. In how many instances have you declined to prosecute someone who was eventually charged with homicide?
So I would have to check with my team to get back to you, but sitting here today, I'm not aware of an instance.
You don't know that for a fact? That's not something that you would...
Of the 15,000 arrests that occurred last year, I would like to check before confirming on the record.
Well, I'm talking about those that commit homicide. I would assume that you would keep some sort of record of what their interaction with the police have been and what your interaction with your office has been with those individuals.
So what I can tell you is we are tracking the recidivism rates of individuals that we charge versus individuals that we didn't charge in 2022, and what we've actually seen is that the recidivism rate is actually slightly higher for the individuals we charged than the individuals we didn't charge.
I'm out of time. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Chair recognizes Ms. Ballot from Vermont for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for being here. Before I get started with my line of questioning, I just want to say a lot has been made about the drop in achievement of DC students, and I just want to tether us back to some context and reality, which is the pandemic and the ongoing trauma from the pandemic caused scores to drop for every single racial, economic, and demographic student subgroup across the nation. This is not particular to the District of Columbia. Now, Madam Mayor, thank you for being here. I'm sorry you have to be here, but I appreciate your time. Now, congressional interference in DC's local affairs and the denial of statehood have very real consequences. When Congress passed the CARES Act and gave each state a minimum of $1.25 billion in fiscal relief, DC received only $495 million, even though it pays full federal taxes and has a larger population than 2 states, including the state that I'm proud to represent, Vermont. It took a full year for DC to finally receive its fair share, and that only occurred after Democrats took control of Congress and retroactively secured the $755 million for DC in the American Rescue Plan. Obviously, completely and totally unfair and tied your hands behind your back in terms of giving your residents the support that they needed. Now, as part of congressional Republicans' efforts to enact a nationwide abortion ban, Congress has long prohibited D.C. from spending funds raised from D.C. taxpayers on abortion. The prohibition was lifted in 2009, but the day the ban was reimposed in 2011, at least 28 women on Medicaid who were scheduled to have abortions were told their health insurance no longer covered the procedure. To this day, women in D.C. who are covered by Medicare are denied coverage for abortion. Mayor Bowser, 90% of the D.C. residents enrolled in Medicaid are people of color. What impact does this have on the women of D.C. who would like to have full health care options available to them?
Well, you outlined just another glaring indignity that we suffer, that our locally raised monies from our tax dollars, our residents who pay income taxes and property taxes, our businesses who pay income taxes and property taxes that support our local budget, we are denied how we use that budget. And we know that that can have tremendous impacts on people along the economic income band. So why is it that a person of means has greater access to healthcare choices than a person who is on Medicaid? It's not fair. And it's something that should change. It's not the only thing. However, we can't tax and regulate cannabis, for example, which we do think has a public safety impact. The men and women of the police department are battling gray market cannabis sales daily, that if we had a tax and regulate system, we could implement a more safe system.
And Mayor Bowser, what do you think would happen if Republicans continue to push their national abortion ban and continue to push their interference in the District of Columbia? What do you think that will do on rights of your citizens that you represent here in terms of them getting the health care they need and deserve?
Well, I hope what it will do is wake up women around our country, especially women in the suburbs. I think we've already seen evidence of this in suburbs around American cities who may be conservative, but they do not like the idea of their daughter having less rights than they have. And so they're going to elect people that respect the bodily autonomy of American women. And I actually think this is the link to DC residents. When that happens, we will advance the cause of statehood.
I agree. Congress has no business getting in between women and their doctors, and no business wasting your time. Thank you for being here. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Timmons from South Carolina for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I went to undergrad at GW. I lived at 15th and I McPherson Square, 2003 to 2007. I lived in Chinatown from 2010 to 2011. And I have been in D.C., mostly the Navy Yard, Capitol Hill area, since 2018. This is the least safe it has ever been. Law enforcement seems to have the lowest morale, judging by a number of factors. And I want to help solve this problem. I want this city to be the beacon that it should be for the world. I want people to come here and be impressed and think that the best days are ahead for the United States. I do not feel that they feel that way when they come here now. And when my constituents come to D.C., I warn them of things that they should and should not do, and that should not be the case. So we need to do something, and I want to help. After our last hearing that we had, Councilman Allen was kind enough to come and sit with me and Congressman Armstrong in my office just last week. We had a great conversation. I've identified 4 areas that I think that we need to address as a group. Congress has 2 of them, DC has 2 of them. I'm going to address the DC components, and Congressman Armstrong is going to follow up later with the structural reforms and the financial support that Congress can offer. So the 2 DC components are 1, criminal code and bail reform, and 2, anti-vagrancy laws. So let's start with anti-vagrancy laws. There's 5,000 people that are currently homeless in DC, experiencing homelessness, and we need to help them. We need to help them get back on their feet. We need to find a way to get them food, shelter, mental health services, job opportunities, so they are not living under $3.95. They're not living in Georgetown under the White Horse Freeway. I mean, I realize that steps have been taken, but they have been insufficient in my view, and we need to make sure that there are no homeless people in D.C. and that they transition to opportunities as quickly as possible. So that's one issue that I'm going to send this to the mayor shortly. The next thing is the criminal code and bail reform. We need to send a message to the people that live and visit Washington, D.C., that the criminal code is fair, but if you are a repeat offender, it is harsh. because we need to have a deterrent threat. And bail reform, we cannot have repeat offenders that continue to commit crimes, get out, and then commit worse crimes. And I'm not going to go through all the different things. I think that there needs to be a tiered structure that would allow fairness. If somebody does something, makes a mistake, we need to help them get back on their feet. But there are bad people in the world, and we need to separate them from society. So I think that the criminal code and bail reform is a part of this. So I guess let's start with the homelessness issue. Mayor Bowser, do you agree that we can do more? And if Congress comes to the table to help change some structural issues and give some financial support, can we address this in a more meaningful way?
Well, thank you for your concern about our residents who are experiencing homelessness. Some of them are native to Washington, D.C. Some of them come to Washington, D.C. Because we are the capital and the seat of government. I've been proud over my 8 years as mayor to have a comprehensive approach to doing that. You'll see that we've driven down family homelessness by more than 70%.
Do you agree that we have a major, major problem in Washington, D.C. as it relates to homelessness?
We have 221 people as of today's count who are living on the street. Those are the people that you were referring to.
Councilman Allen gave me the 5,000 number. He sent me a report that was
There are not
produced by your...
5,000 people living on the street, sir. Those may be people
There's
that
221 people living under 395. We can go right now. It's 300 yards away. What are you talking about?
I'm talking about facts, and there are not 300 people under 295 or 395. We have outreach teams that are out and across all 8 wards, and we actually know.
Let's move on to the criminal code. Do you think that
those are the facts.
Your own councilman sent me a report saying 5,000 people were homeless in D.C. Okay, look, we're going to move on. Criminal code bail reform. If Congress comes to the table and gives you all additional accountability with your and additional jurisdiction, and as well as additional resources, whether it's a new prison, whether it's homeless rehabilitation center, increased funding for law enforcement, prosecutors, whatever you need to fix this problem, can council come to the table and in a more serious manner address the criminal code and bail to make sure that the people feel that they cannot commit crimes and get off and not be prosecuted?
Well, we understand that the Council's Committee on Public Safety and the Judiciary will take up the criminal code revision in the coming months, and we stand ready to assist them with that work. You may have heard
I'm running out of time. I'm sorry. He's going to follow up. Congressman Armstrong's going to follow up, but we're here to help. We're willing to provide additional jurisdiction, accountability, structural reforms, perhaps some financial support to address some of your challenges. I just hope that we can find a way to make this place the city that we all know it should be. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We would take you up on your offer to assist. While we have a plan to replace our DC jail, we expect our capital dollars to be more constrained in the coming years, and we would happily work with you on an appropriation.
Chair recognizes Ms. Lee from Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our country's founders believed that taxation without representation was tyrannical. It's been stated. The United States is the only democratic country that denies voting representation on the national level to the residents of the Capitol. I'm sure it's no coincidence that those residents that our colleagues on the other side of the aisle are seeking to oversee without representation are over 45% Black. This tenet of no taxation without representation helped launch the American Revolution as enshrined in the Declaration of Independence. Yet Congress requires the nearly 700,000 D.C. residents to pay all federal taxes, but denies them voter representation in Congress. Mayor Bowser, do you think not having 2 senators to represent D.C. has impacted federal funding and policies?
Absolutely. Your colleague just mentioned one very specific thing that happened during our response to COVID, where we were inexplainably grouped in as a territory for the purposes of the CARES Act, which none of us know how that happened or if it has ever happened previously. So that's one such way. I also think not having 2 senators for the district impacts this region. Maryland, D.C., and Virginia, over 4 million people making up this DMV region with 2 senators when we should have 6 senators. And we know how important that will be in discussions, regional discussions, for example, like how we're going to fund Washington Union Station. It's going to be a spectacular renovation, cost $8 billion. How we deal with the fiscal cliff that we know is coming towards our transit authority, which serves the district, Maryland, and Virginia. And by the way, other transit authorities around the country are going to be coming to the Congress too. That's almost $1 billion. So we know, in having 6 senators represent this more than 4 million person region, is representative democracy.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for those examples. D.C. pays more federal taxes per capita than any state, and overall, D.C. pays more federal taxes than 19 states. The last 2 states to enter the union, Alaska and Hawaii, combined pay half the federal taxes D.C. pays. Alabama, Kansas, and North Dakota, which are all represented by Republicans on this committee, each pays less in federal taxes than D.C. On a per capita basis, D.C. pays 5 times the federal taxes of Chairman Comer's home state of Kentucky. Mayor Bowser, as a 5th-generation Washingtonian yourself and the elected mayor of the nearly 700,000 D.C. residents, what do you hear from your constituents about being taxed without voting representation in Congress?
Well, I will tell you, Congressman, it's changing. We've always been proud to pay our fair share.
Which are all represented by Republicans on this committee, each pays less in federal taxes than D.C. On a per capita basis, D.C. pays 5 times the federal taxes of Chairman Comer's home state of Kentucky. Mayor Bowser, as a 5th-generation Washingtonian yourself and the elected mayor of the nearly 700,000 D.C. residents, what do you hear from your constituents about being taxed without voting representation in Congress?
Well, I will tell you, Congressman, it's changing. We've always been proud to pay our fair share. You just outlined how we actually pay more. We give more to the federal government than we get back. And frequently, some people think we're agency of the federal government. Some people think that everything that we have has been paid by federal tax dollars, and that couldn't be worse than the truth. People have started to say to me, Mayor, why are we paying taxes? Why don't we withhold our taxes and see what happens? And so I think that we're proud Americans. We're proud to host the federal government and to pay our fair share. But enough's enough. Our congresswoman should be able to vote for us. Just look at all of the things that she's been able to accomplish for the district. Taking advantage of federal lands, creating jobs, turning underutilized park space into active spaces. And we know that we could do so much more with the votes that our American citizenship should guarantee.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. D.C. residents have been petitioning for voting representation in Congress for over 200 years. But instead of acting on that, this Republican-led Congress has taken every chance to strike down the will of the people and encroach on their ability to self-govern. The people and the residents of D.C. don't want to be able to sightsee Congress people and senators in restaurants and bars, and they don't want to see y'all driving by and blocking traffic in your black Suburbans. They want their own representation. Taxation without representation is as wrong today as it was in 1776. Yet this shameful practice is alive and well in our nation's capital. Since day one, the heart of this issue has been impeding black political power, let's just say it. When D.C. becomes a state, it will have the highest proportion of black residents of any state. We need to affirm their right to self-determination. Admitting D.C. into the union would right this wrong. I yield back.
Thank you.
Lady yields. Chair recognizes Mr. Armstrong from North Dakota for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. D.C. is unique. The U.S. Attorney's Office here is unique, with the exception of some Indian reservations that exist across the country. This is one of the only places where you have primary prosecutorial authority. I appreciate what Mayor Bowser said about the jail. I think we should look at some different things. I'm going to get to BOP here in a second. But just for Mr. Graves, what structural disadvantages do you have in dealing with the primary prosecutorial aspect of the U.S. Attorney's Office that we can work on?
This is a really important point, and I appreciate the question, and I think the mayor very eloquently laid out the complicated soup that she referenced. I mean, some of the services provided in the criminal justice ecosystem come from the federal government, some come from the state side, and we have to interact together and make it work, because we have no choice but to make it work, because that's the current system.
And, I mean, to be fair, I mean, if it's a resource issue, if we need more prosecutors, I mean, we need those types of issues set up, we're willing to do that. I'll go to the BOP for a second, because I think it's unique and I think it's important. Anybody who gets sentenced to a year in D.C. goes into the Bureau of Prisons. Mayor Bowser, in your opening statement, you said you're seeing a rise in repeat offenders. One of the things we've learned, it doesn't matter if it's a conservative state like North Dakota, a Democratic state like New Jersey, starting to develop, I'm the co-chair of the Second Chance Task Force. It's very unique when you get out of prison and you get out of the Bureau of Prisons, because once you go into the Bureau of Prisons, you're sent anywhere. Where we have learned locally, we have learned how to do this in other places. The last 6 months of your sentence, it could be a 7-year sentence, could be an 18-month sentence, could be a 10-year sentence. If we do it right and deal with services in transition and dealing with those issues, you can put people coming out of custody in the best chance to succeed and the least chance of recidivism. We know we need a new jail here. Anybody who thinks we don't should go, and outside of everything else. But I think we should also take this opportunity to start looking at some things that, quite honestly, states do better than the federal government. And I don't care where somebody is sent after they get. I think people are, particularly for nonviolent felony offenses, the data will show the closer you are to your family and your community, the better chance you have of not having recidivism, and I think we should address some of those things. But I do think we should start having conversations if we're gonna resource the jail, if we're gonna rebuild it. We should also start talking about potentially putting in a program where wherever they're at, they could be at the work farm in Duluth, but if they're getting back out, the current model of BOP prisons where you just put them on a bus and send them loose isn't fair to the victims if it's a victim crime, isn't fair to the community where they're coming back from, and it's set up for failure instead of success. So I think we have opportunities here to do some things in a different way, and I'm thinking, just outside of all the differences and disconnects that we have between Democrats and Republicans, we have maybe even sitting on this table, that we have an opportunity to do some things because we know what works. We know what works. And we know for a fact, I mean, this is very different than a historical drug conspiracy where you're getting 17 years in the federal penitentiary. You guys are in charge of primary enforcement. And if it's sourcing the crime lab, although I would argue the crime lab, you recognize a little bit what a lot of states all over the country go through. There's a reason we're trying to get historical rape tests tested again all across the country and those things. But I think we instead of demonizing all of this stuff all the time, we have an opportunity to do this. And I agree with Mr. Timmons in that if it's a resource issue, we're willing to look at the resource issue, but I also think it's an issue of how we deliver these services, whether it's coming in or coming out. If you need more prosecutors to deal with first-time offenders, we need to know that. If you need more ability to communicate with the local police department, so you guys are, the enforcement and the prosecutorial missions are more copacetic, we need to do that. But I do think we have an ability to do some of this, and there's some smart things we can do here as we're moving through it, because we're willing to spend the money if the money's spent appropriately and if we're doing it. Mayor Bowser, you look like you want to say something.
I do want to say something because
That wasn't supposed to be a 4-minute
Okay.
rant, but I get
All
fired
right.
up on this stuff.
we do need more prosecutors. We do. They don't work for me, they work for the U.S. Attorney, but we need more prosecutors. I've heard the U.S. Attorney say they're not prosecuting a lot of misdemeanors, but this is my way of thinking, and this is how my police officers think. If they are arresting people, they've been saying for years that we're gonna arrest them, then they're gonna be right back out, because they know that they're not gonna be prosecuted even if it's a misdemeanor. But misdemeanors indicate, in my view, a sense of lawlessness. And that sense of lawlessness grows. So if they're making, and I know they have to be efficient with their resources, and we can appreciate that, but let's make sure they have enough prosecutors, and the U.S. Attorney can tell you what he thinks, to prosecute our homicides, but also to prosecute our gun offenses, because a felon in possession of a gun should be prosecuted.
I agree completely, and we're 20 seconds over line. I will say it's unique in that this is the one space where U.S. Attorney's Office actually deals with misdemeanors as a primary offense. But I will also say globally across the entire, one of the biggest mistakes that has been made is catch and release on misdemeanors. Because if you're doing catch and release on misdemeanors and it's a 19-year-old offender, by 22 they're going to be a felon. That's just the reality.
I'm sorry, Congressman, do you want me to respond?
I'm way out of time, but I'll take any extra if anybody's got it. I yield back.
Very good discussion. Chair recognizes Mr. Kassar of Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Graves, just because it sounded like you were going to chime in, can you talk a little bit about recidivism and how it is y'all take actions to make sure that folks aren't, not recommitting crimes? What are you all finding?
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. So in response to the resource question, every prosecutor will tell you, every head of a prosecuting organization will tell you, I will take more prosecutors and I can do more with more. So yes, and we're incredibly appreciative of the fiscal year 23 budget that was passed that provided additional resources for prosecutors. We received additional prosecutors in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia because of that. We would ask that the President's fiscal year 24 budget be fully funded because that would allow for additional prosecutors. And of course, if you want to go above the budget request, we would take more prosecutors. I want to be clear, with respect to misdemeanors, I view them as a public safety issue. Our office, there is no category of misdemeanors that our office is refusing or declining to prosecute. I share in the sentiment that has been expressed that misdemeanors have a tremendous impact on the community. That's why when we have sufficient evidence, we move forward with misdemeanors. And I want to increase the rates, and our office, along with the mayor, have taken steps in the wake of DFS's loss of accreditation to get us the testing that we need in order to prosecute these misdemeanors. A large percentage of the misdemeanor cases that we are prosecuting are drug possession offenses. We want to prosecute those drug possession offenses so that we can get those individuals under court supervision into treatment programs and hopefully address the root cause that is driving the criminal conduct.
Thank you, Mr. Graves. In my district, in the 35th District of Texas, I'm proud that 60,000 of my constituents are veterans and active military. They have a voice and a vote in Congress. But here in D.C., there's over 30,000 veterans who, while they have a powerful voice here in Congress with Ms. Holmes Norton, they are not given an equal vote. When these citizens enlisted, they knew that there was a chance that they might never see their friends or family ever again. They signed up knowing that they could hold their representative in Congress accountable for our votes that put their lives on the line. But service members from D.C. do not have that same right. D.C. residents also have no vote in the Senate, where military leadership is confirmed. D.C. residents pay taxes to fund wars, but have no say in whether or not our country goes to war. D.C. residents have served bravely in our military for the entire history of our country, and some have paid the ultimate price, their lives, for a country that denies them voting representation in Congress and full local government. Mayor Bowser, what message does it send to D.C. military families and veterans when the country they've risked their lives for refuses to afford them basic democratic rights?
Well, obviously, it sends the wrong message, Congressman, and we often find that our service members have more need. And they have to call on the government from everything from how they access their VA benefits to sometimes needing housing supports and services, and they want to make sure that they're fully represented. They also have grievances, and they want to be able to have those grievances heard by voting members of the Congress that can make changes. They know how the system works, and they probably best know how to make it work better for themselves and their families.
Thank you for that. My experience representing Military USA in San Antonio and then veterans and military families throughout Central Texas is that indeed so many of our veterans and active service members are great participants in our democracy and help us make this system work better. And I believe that with DC statehood, those active military members and veterans would be best served here in DC. We're continuing to see this trend of picking on cities that are trying to do their jobs spread across the country. Today in Texas, the Senate is considering voting on a bill to wipe out water breaks rules for construction workers in Dallas, eviction protections for renters in Austin. They're picking on the city of San Antonio for a variety of things, including, I think, a paid sick days ordinance. I think that it is incumbent on us as a Congress to try to support D.C., both give you statehood and try to support you rather than getting in the way. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Thank you.
Chair recognizes Ms. Luna from Florida for 5 minutes.
Pretty appalling to hear some of these crime stats from some of my colleagues, but in reading some of your testimony, Mayor, and then also just hearing the back and forth, I realized that you have actually been more pro-law enforcement than your city council. And I think there's no clear, really example of that with what happened recently with the DC Council's decision to rewrite the city's criminal code, which thank goodness was overturned. But obviously what Americans want is effective leadership in their nation's capital, and that understanding the experience of residents and visitors is incredibly important, not just leaders that are apparently out of touch with issues plaguing the city. Mayor Bowser, I wanted to ask you why it is that you think your city council is working so hard against you to ensure the safety of residents and visitors.
I think our city council is concerned about safety of residents and visitors. It won't surprise anybody that we have philosophical differences. My views on how to make the city safer are well known, and I believe that they were affirmed by voters last year in bringing me back for a third term. But I also think that Americans are having these discussions in cities and towns all across our country. And what I hear them telling me when I go to visit places, they're not really concerned about my city council or me, but they do want to make sure that Washington is working. And when I say that, I'm talking about federal Washington.
I think, but my question is more so focusing right now in that I have constituents that come up, like some of my colleagues had mentioned, and they don't feel safe walking around. I don't feel safe walking around. And when you had a fellow member of Congress that was brutally attacked by someone that had a criminal record that was obviously showing that this person was disturbed, and then you had the failure of prosecution for that. That, to me, does not signify a safe city. In fact, we're looking and we're seeing that sexual abuse offenses have increased over 48% in just 1 year's time frame from 2022 to 2023. My next question would be for you, Mr. Graves, just as a personal understanding. I understand you're married, yes?
I'm sorry, I missed a lot.
I understand that you're married?
Yes.
Okay, and you have children?
Yes.
So I would assume that you are against violence against women.
Yes, of course.
So my question for you is, there's been many concerns brought up by my colleagues that you have actively chosen to ignore certain cases, and as a result of that, it's impacting people that ultimately are relying on you to do your job in order to make them feel safe. In the instance of my colleague that was attacked, I mean, my goodness, she's coming downstairs from her apartment. You have a crazy man that goes in, has a criminal history, should have been locked up prior, and yet he wasn't. And I just want to know why, because I understand that if that was your wife or that was your child, I assume that you would have pressed charges. Would you have not?
So I understand the concern for the community and keeping all of our fellow community members safe. We are prosecuting the individual you're referencing.
But he had a track record, and he was allowed back on the streets, and those actions that were taken against him were clearly not done in a way that caused him to understand that he can no longer do that. This person was a disturbed individual. He should have been given a more harsher sentence. My question is would you have allowed that to happen if that was your wife or your child? Yes or no?
So
Is a yes or no?
So it's not a yes or no
It
question.
is a yes or no, because you have people that are directly being impacted and hurt by these people, and you're failing to do your job. Just like Representative Bigg had asked you for your perspective on a case where someone was obviously being charged with a more harsher sentence than they deserved, and yet you're sitting here trying to argue that when people clearly don't feel safe. People are arguing about statehood. Statehood, fine, if a city can actually manage cases, but the city can't even prosecute adolescents cases. And that is your responsibility. So I'm not trying to be a jerk here, but what I am asking is for you to do your job and make people feel safe, especially those that are depending on you to do it when you see cases of, 48% increase in sexual assault cases. My goodness.
So
That's it. I've heard enough. Chairman, I yield my time.
Congresswoman.
Thank you.
Congresswoman, may I address your question about sexual abuse? I know the chief wants to talk about it.
We only have 26 seconds left, but
We do have a lot to say about that, and when time allows.
I will contact your office.
Thank you.
Lady yields back. Chair recognizes Ms. Crockett from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I don't know that I can get through all that I need to say in 5 minutes, but I'm gonna do my best. We're gonna start off with sexual abuse. I am so excited that my colleagues across the aisle care about sexual abuse, considering that the front runner right now for presidency is kind of just been found liable of sexual abuse. So I'm excited because this may mean that finally some folk will back off from supporting him because we don't support sexual abusers in this chamber. So I'm happy about this. But let's talk about facts versus fiction. My Republican colleagues want to talk about being tough on crime and keeping criminals off the streets. And so we've talked about, let's talk about what is criminal. We've got members of Congress elected in other states, other cities, trying to subvert democracy and the will of the people of D.C. by dictating that the city act in a way the Republicans want because they think they know what's best. Republicans want to subvert the people's power, and it's not just for D.C., it's all over. We see this in states like Texas and North Carolina with gerrymandering. In fact, we still have members here who still think that Trump won in 2020. Republicans want to talk about crime and violence, but they don't want to admit their role in this crisis. The fact is that they still allow assault weapons in the hands of radical right extremists, which have forced families visiting a mall in my state of Texas to leave a mall with nothing more than trauma, hurt, and despair as a neo-Nazi terrorized them, and yet what did they have in their hand? Another AR-15, but we don't want to have a conversation about that. So if we're going to talk about crime and the reasons for the increase in them, we've got to talk about these root causes. Number one, the fact that we have elected legislators that won't do their job and protect people by keeping these weapons off the streets. That's number one. Number two, we are still reeling from a financial crisis, and guess what? They don't want to make it better. I'm sure they all campaigned and said, oh, we're going to help out the economy post-COVID. But right now, we are on a cliff over the debt ceiling. The debt ceiling that was raised 3 times under Trump, and 25% of this credit card bill that they don't want to pay was accrued under Trump, and he only had 1 term. And hopefully he won't have no more. Nevertheless, I digress. Let me move on. So let's also talk about the fact that just recently, I think it was yesterday or 2 days ago, we received reports that there is a staff member who's working for a Republican on this committee who has ties with and supports a white nationalist who has proclaimed himself to be just like Hitler. I don't really know what to say, except for the fact that this is a farce, all right? Because the fact is, we've got an increase in crime all over. If we really want to be real about it, let's talk about it. We're talking about D.C. right now, but the murder rates in red states like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama have statistically exceeded those in blue states like Illinois, New Mexico, and Michigan every year since 2000. But since my colleagues feel the need to meddle in local affairs of D.C., then let's look at where there might be issues. To be clear, D.C. doesn't control most of its own post-arrest criminal justice system. Instead, the federal government administers most of it. So I have a few questions, yes or no, for you, Mayor Bowser. The federal government, not D.C., has the authority to prosecute nearly all crimes committed by adults under D.C. law.
That's correct.
The federal government appoints judges to the local D.C. courts.
That's correct.
The federal government has jurisdiction over community supervision and adults charged or convicted of D.C. crimes.
That's correct.
The federal government has jurisdiction over the incarceration of adults convicted of felonies under D.C. law.
Correct.
Lastly, Mayor Bowser,
isn't the federal government responsible for parole and supervised release of people convicted of felonies under DC law?
Yes.
Thank you. The fact is, my Republican colleagues want to talk about keeping DC streets crime-free. They can't even keep the halls of Congress crime-free, because we gonna talk about this, because I got 24 seconds. My freshman colleague has just been indicted on 13 counts, 13 felony counts, right? But have they exhibited any courage to say, you know what, we will disallow this in our body. We will make sure that we expel this individual. They have not. So what I don't want to hear is that they care about crime, because if they did, they would start by cleaning up our own house and mind our own business instead of coming after DC. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Congresswoman.
Chair recognizes Ms. McClain from Michigan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you all for being here today. I appreciate it. I'm going to turn the focus a little bit over to the law-abiding citizens. I'm going to try and make it a nonpartisan and make it more about the law-abiding citizens, because I think, you know, we just got done with Mother's Day, and I think I have one of the best moms that's ever walked the face of the earth, so happy Mother's Day again, Mom. But I look back to all the lessons that my mom taught me. Was for every action, there's a reaction. And if you do an action and that's a bad action, you got to pay the consequences, Lisa. So you can make your own decisions, but when your decisions or when your actions hurt someone else, then you have to pay the consequences. And there are some things Mom can help you with and some things but she can't. But you have to be responsible and more importantly, accountable for your actions. And I hear her on my shoulder chirping in my ear constantly. So I think Mom's done her job. But let me just start. In May, as of May 9th of this year, total crime, I know you've heard the stats, but I think they bear repeating. Total crime up 27% in DC from the same time last year. Motor vehicle theft up 110%. Homicides up 12%. Sexual abuse is up 53%. And property crime is up 30%. That's not a good position for the law-abiding citizens to be in. And I think we need to really take a good long look at why. And I think it goes back, and I hear my mom in my back, on my shoulder, consequence to the action. What is the consequence to your action? Because if my curfew was at 10 o'clock and I came home at 10:05, there was a consequence to my action. And sometimes it was a little harsher than I thought, but I responded to that consequence. And the next time I came home at 9:50, I wasn't late. But despite a sharp increase in crime, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia declined to prosecute 67% of individuals arrested in D.C. in 2022. 67% of the people that committed an action didn't have a consequence to their action. I wonder what behavior that led to. I wonder if anyone can connect those dots. According to Police Chief Robert Contee, the average homicide suspect had been arrested 11 times prior to them committing the homicide. I wonder if we would have had a consequence to that action a little bit sooner if we would have had the same result. Right? My mom has zero time in law enforcement, but I think her concepts really make sense. So Mayor Bowser, do you think violent and repeat offenders should be kept in jail?
I believe in consequences as well.
Thank you.
Congresswoman. But I also believe that it's complicated. And that
life is complicated. Life is complicated for the law-abiding citizen,
Absolutely.
too. And sometimes I'm sorry.
I don't disagree.
It's really quick. Do you
Yes.
believe that violent repeat offenders should be kept in jail? And if the answer is I don't know or it depends,
I will say that I advanced a piece of legislation that addresses the issue that you're raising.
So yes?
For for a person who has been convicted of a violent crime and is arrested for another violent crime, I am suggesting that we close what I see as a gap in our law.
I agree with you, but I think you're missing the
And give the
point.
courts the ability to detain them while they await trial.
So is that a yes?
It's a yes in some cases. Yes, I think that this is,
And therein
I
lies the
believe
problem.
firmly, this is what I believe firmly, Congresswoman, and we've been focused on taking guns off our street. We can have a-
Let me stop you because I don't want to get, I have another
Okay.
question. Do you have any concerns that the average homicide suspect has been arrested 11 times prior to committing the murder, Mr. Graves? I mean, that 11 times.
Yes, we have concerns with anybody who's arrested. I do want to clarify that same study, which was talking about a point in time, almost all of those people had been prosecuted for some of their conduct. 75% of them were under court supervision at some point in time in their lives, and 25%
But it
of them...
didn't work, right? It didn't work.
Yeah, 25% of them were under
Right.
court supervision at the time of the offense.
Right, okay. So can you explain to the committee why your office is declining to prosecute so many people? I mean, 67%, I'm already down. Thank you all for your time, and thank you again to my mom for talking about consequence. Actions have consequences.
Chair recognizes Mr. Garcia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Mayor Bowser and Mr. Graves for being here today. Particularly, Mayor Bowser, before I came to Congress, I was mayor of Long Beach for 8 years. I know it's a very tough job, and I'm certainly no stranger to criminal justice reform and the work that all of you do every single day. Just to your entire team, and from the police leadership to everyone else, just thank you for your work. I've also always said that we need to get more mayors and local officials elected to Congress, but certainly today and some of the questions we've heard is not exactly what I had in mind. This is already our second committee hearing on this topic, and I feel oftentimes like I'm back at my city council meetings. If members of this committee wanted to focus on crime, they should run for office in D.C. Clearly, they're very interested in what you all do as it relates to crime here at the local jurisdiction, yet they're not as interested in discussing crime and gun violence in their own districts and states. Instead of having a meaningful discussion about public safety, which we can always have, we continue to show as a committee, unfortunately through the majority, our contempt for the people of Washington, D.C. D.C. residents are Americans who deserve the same rights to federal representation that each of our constituents have across the country. Republicans are hauling in our district's duly elected leaders, our appointed officials, before this committee for the high crime of supporting measures to support and change our criminal justice system. Obviously, this is personally, I believe, embarrassing to this committee. This is not the format. We should not be bringing you in to discuss these issues. Instead, we should be uplifting and supporting statehood for all of you. It's also telling that Republicans are choosing to target Washington, D.C., even though many places across the country are dealing with much higher crimes than the district and crime rates. In fact, I think, we've said this before at the last hearing, it's been said multiple times, I've read this personally as well, violent crime in Washington, D.C. has actually dropped in the last year overall. And yes, there are serious challenges around crime and public safety in all big cities. We know this to be true. But crime overall in Washington, D.C. has dropped 45% in the last 10 years. And if you look at the last few decades, D.C. is actually a safer place, and we should not forget that. Yes, there are still challenges, but the progress is going in the right direction. And if we want to talk about violent crime, we should be talking about issues around guns. The rate of gun deaths in Mississippi is over 30% higher than it is in D.C. Rates are also higher in Louisiana, in Missouri, in Alabama, in Alaska, in Arkansas, and South Carolina, all higher than the rates here in D.C. Yet we're not bringing in the governors of these other states in front of our committee and not asking them and probing them questions. I'm not really sure why. But it's clear that my Republican colleagues really don't care about the violence that are facing American communities. They want to make political points. I've only been here for 5 months, but I've seen House Democrats sponsor numerous gun reform and gun violence legislation, whether it's been trying to ban assault weapons, high-capacity magazines, bump stocks, universal background checks, all things that could actually help reduce violent crime. And if Republicans really wanted to reduce violent crime, they could reach across the aisle and bring forward some of this legislation. Now, instead, we're going to debate whether 700,000 American citizens in our nation's capital deserve the right to self-determination. And Mayor Bowser, especially to you, as a former mayor, I'm sorry you have to be here today, where you should be at City Hall doing the people's work. The people, of course, have you here as their mayor, and I thank you for being here. But since you are here and our Republicans are so interested in dropping crime, I was wondering if you have any advice for the governors of Mississippi, Louisiana, Missouri, Alabama, Alaska, Arkansas, and South Carolina, all of whom have higher rates of gun deaths and violence than the district. Do you have any advice for them about what those states could possibly do to really bring forward some criminal justice reform in those states? I'm sure my colleagues will take that information and pass it along to their governors.
The advice I would give them is what I give to all of the members of the Congress as well, is we need common sense gun reform, Congressman. We need to keep kids safe in schools, Congressman. And we need to do the things that most Americans agree with, background checks. And I have to, much has been said about disagreements I've had with our council, and we agree wholeheartedly on a piece of legislation that I know will make the district safer. It will decrease instances of domestic violence as well, and that's red flag laws. Governors and state houses all over our country should be focused on common sense reforms that will keep our kids and families safe.
Thank you, Mayor, for that good advice, and I definitely encourage our governors to take that advice as well. And with that, I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Burchett from Tennessee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members, thank you, ma'am. I used to be a county mayor myself, so it's the best job I ever had. So
Yes,
thank you for being
I
here,
agree.
ma'am. Mr. Graves, besides the juvenile crime, your office also handles all the criminal prosecutions for the District of Columbia. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, I just want to make sure I understood the question. Outside of juvenile crime, we handle adult crime, but juvenile crime was handled by the D.C. Office of Attorney General.
That was my point.
Yes.
In 2015, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia declined to prosecute 35% of the cases. Is that correct?
That's consistent with my recollection, roughly.
And yes or no, you were sworn in as U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia in November of 2021. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. I think you testified earlier that the percentage of criminal cases your office declined to prosecute in 2022 was 67%. Does that sound correct?
That's not correct. That's fiscal year 2022. So it both predates when I was sworn in and postdates.
Okay. The total crime, though, is up 27% from the same time last year. So I don't think it's a lack of criminals. Why does your office decline to prosecute so many of these cases?
So thank you for the question, and I welcome the opportunity to explain. And Congresswoman McClain actually had a great chart that answered a lot of your question. The one thing not reflected on the chart is throughout the period.
Congresswoman McClain tends to confuse me, so I'll just ask me and you will just.
And I wish I had her chart to help me explain, but the one thing not reflected on the chart is that every year we charge roughly 90% of the most serious violent felonies. What changed, and you can see the change start in fiscal year 2017 and kind of incrementally step down each year, was our handling of misdemeanors. And there are complicated reasons. This obviously, we're talking about going across 3 administrations and 5 U.S. attorneys. We are working on some of the issues that led to these declinations with misdemeanors, and the numbers are going up.
Okay. In an interview in the Washington Post, you said your office is continuing to prosecute most of the violent felonies, but we're declining less serious cases. And is that correct? Does that sound within your recollection?
Yes.
Okay. And in the same interview, you said the cases you declined mostly came after arrests in cases like gun possession, drug possession, and other misdemeanors. Does that sound right?
So that generally sounds correct for fiscal year 2022. I would like to clarify the quote in light of a prior exchange, though.
Okay. Are you aware that your predecessor, Channing Phillips, who wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post titled, "D.C. should not disregard misdemeanor crimes, but should keep focusing on rehabilitation programs"?
Yes, I am aware. That was in response to an op-ed that ran in the Washington Post encouraging the U.S. Attorney's Office to stop prosecuting misdemeanor offenses at all.
Right. The only people who generally read those op-eds are the ones that were written about. So are you aware that the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office, which includes Detroit, only declined to prosecute 33% of the cases in 2022?
Yes, I've seen figures reported from other jurisdictions. It's important to note when you're comparing to other jurisdictions, it's often apples to oranges comparisons. Some jurisdictions, for instance, the police can automatically file charges. There are no prosecutorial reviews, and then there's subsequent dismissals by the prosecutors after charges are filed.
Okay. But do you know that Chicago only declined 14% of their cases?
Yes, and that's an automatic file jurisdiction.
Okay. And Philadelphia, only 4%.
I've seen that figure reported, yes.
Okay. Mr. Contee, is that correct? How I say that name? Is it Contee?
It's Contee, sir.
Chief?
Yes, sir.
Chief Contee, okay. My name gets massacred pretty regular, too, so.
No worries.
All right, thank you. Didn't you say that the average homicide suspect has been arrested 11 times prior to them committing a homicide?
I did.
And so you could see how Mr. Graves' apparent soft-on-crime policies could actually make residents and visitors feel less safe?
I don't think it's Mr. Graves' policies necessarily. I think it's a combination of things, sir.
Okay. Mr. Graves, my office gives 4 to 5 constituents tours a week for, groups. Hundreds of families from East Tennessee come to visit the Capitol every year. All the members before you come to D.C. every session every week. We all have staff living in D.C. I think your decision to decline 67% of the cases, regardless of the reasons, put our offices at risk, but most importantly, it puts my constituents and the constituents and every member here up at risk. I think it's unacceptable, and frankly, I think in some cases it's disgraceful. Thank you all for being here. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Moskowitz from Florida for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the mayor for being here and your approach to this issue over the last several months and quite frankly the last several years. I want to remind my colleagues across the aisle that 6 out of the top 10 high crime states are red states. So I assume at some point, since we're now the crime committee, I assume at some point we're going to have the attorney generals from those states to talk about what we can do in those red states on crime. It's interesting that I guess we want to be the D.C. Council. And here we are, yet another hearing on crime. And yet we have not heard the other side talk about gun violence. Again, I want to remind them gun violence is crime. Mass shootings are crime. We heard that Taiwan has really low crime. Well, Taiwan doesn't allow mentally ill people to buy AR-15s, unlimited ammunition, and body armor. Possibly one reason why Taiwan has slightly lower crime than us. A member of this committee had someone burst into their office and injure staff members. We should be thankful that that person didn't have a gun, because instead of 2 injured staff members, we'd have 2 dead staff members. And yet, we're not doing anything to stop mentally ill people from being able to buy AR-15s and unlimited ammunition in this country. Gun trafficking. Gun trafficking in D.C. is a huge issue. My friends across the aisle like to talk about illegal people all the time, but they don't want to talk about illegal guns. They don't want to talk about all the illegal guns that are being trafficked in D.C. They don't want to say the word gun at all. D.C. went from being a single-digit ghost gun area to now having 461 ghost guns recovered in 2022. In fact, semi-automatic weapons are being converted to automatic weapons. We've seen an increase in that by 340%. We don't hear that at all from the other side, even though they're so focused on crime. We heard a question about myocarditis. Serious, it's a fair question, but also not the leading cause of school-age children dying. That's guns. And so we can't continue to take these hearings serious when we're talking about crime if we're not going to talk about gun violence. You're not in denial. I know you know this. You just don't want to talk about it because it's politically expedient. We heard another member talking about books. Books in school. Look, I'm sure there's a couple of books that, we could take out of the classroom, but books ain't killing kids. And dead kids can't read, to remind you again. And so, we even passed a DC disapproval in Congress. I voted for it, by the way, Mr. Chairman. The president signed it, okay? And so, what I don't understand is why are we wasting this committee's time, the United States Oversight Committee's time, for the second time on just Washington, D.C., just the district, no other state, no other issue? And why, again, are we talking about crime when we're not talking about gun violence? I just came from a hearing on fentanyl, and I had to listen to parents testify and talk about how they're losing their kids to fentanyl. Serious issue. I support the chairman of that committee's bill. The data is clear on fentanyl. But you know what else? The data is clear on gun violence. The numbers don't lie. And yet, we're ignoring it. Perhaps we can maybe depoliticize the issue one day like we're doing with fentanyl, because it's important. Watching parents continue to bury their children because they sent them to school, or they sent them to a movie theater, or they went to a grocery store, or they were in a church, or they were in a synagogue, is despicable. And so, look, I know you guys are busy. I know you got stuff going on. You're trying to find, the fake informant that now has gone missing. I know you're busy with that. But I'm hoping that perhaps the Oversight Committee, if they're so worried about, federal overreach, perhaps they can start, being focused on real government oversight. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Before I recognize Ms. Boebert, with respect to the missing informant, just so you know, just to clarify, the Grassley whistleblower is alive and well. Chair recognizes Ms. Boebert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mayor Bowser, is the District of Columbia more dangerous during your tenure?
Congresswoman, as you have heard, we have experienced over the last 10 years decreases in violent crime, all categories of crime. You also heard me talk about in my testimony, especially in the last 3 years, being very concerned.
What about since last year, Mayor?
What about it?
Is it more dangerous this year than it was last year?
I'm going to ask the chief to give you the
I'm asking,
data.
Mayor, because I see the crime is up 27%. That doesn't sound like a decrease to me. Violent crime is up 13%. And in 2020 and 2021, the city recorded more than 200 homicides in consecutive years for the first time in 20 years. So is Washington, D.C. more dangerous now that you're in office?
The nation is more dangerous with more guns and more violent
We're
crime.
talking about Washington, D.C. here, and we have also seen that the police budget has been cut, $15 million in 2020, Mayor. Do you think that this contributes to an increase in crime?
I think a lot of things have contributed to increases in crime across the country.
What about in Washington, D.C.? Do you think that the $15 million budget cut to MPD in 2020 caused an increase in crime here in the District of Columbia?
I think that we need to have 4,000 police officers over the course of the last several years.
So you want more police officers?
Yes.
Well, in the past, you've hired on average 300 new police officers each year, but in 2022, you hired 103. That's 200 less, and now you're advocating for more police officers after cutting their budget and hiring 200 less police officers.
I've advocated for more police every day as mayor of the District of Columbia. When I became mayor, we were facing a retirement bubble, and we set a course at that time for hiring and retention.
So do you believe that Washington, D.C. would be safer and more secure if you hired more police officers rather than decreasing the number of recruitment by 200?
We're not decreasing recruitment, but we are facing, as cities in police departments around the country less interest in joining police
Why do you
departments.
think that is? Do you think that our police officers have been demonized because of the rhetoric that is flowing from this city and many other cities across our nation?
I think that policing is a tough job.
I would agree.
It's a job that has grown tougher over the years. And I think that
Particularly, when do you think it became more tough? Maybe when they were attacked for doing their jobs, protecting citizens? When they lost their funding?
Congressman, if I'm allowed to speak, I'll
Yes, ma'am.
answer you, but I'm not going to talk over you. And so it has been my experience in the last 8 years that we have had to use more incentives, and we have investigated and researched what it's going to take to attract young people to come into policing. One thing that we have done in the district, for example, is to create a police academy that we're very proud of. Chief Contee, in fact, joined the police academy when he was 17 years old and rose through the ranks to be chief
I don't need
of
to hear
police.
about childhood issues here.
Well, this is how we get
Do you think
how
that
we get
defund the
police.
police signs around District of Columbia and advocating for this
I
is
didn't advocate to
incentivizing?
defund the police.
But you did defund them.
I
$15
did-
million
I did
budget
not-
cut.
I
A
did
$15
not
million
defund the
budget cut
police.
in 2020. So, Madam Mayor, what would you say to the law-abiding citizens here in Washington, D.C., who, because of policies you've supported, are unable to defend themselves with this rise in crime? Crime being up 27%.
Congresswoman, I don't have to come to here to talk to you, to talk to the residents of the District of Columbia. I talk to them daily. I have press
And what do you
conferences.
say to these law-abiding
I'm in
citizens?
What I tell them is that as their mayor, regardless of what's happening nationally, regardless of what's happening in our very complicated criminal justice system, as their mayor, I am charged with making it work. And if that
Is it
means
working?
it is, I am charged with making it work. And what I have
Do you think that you're doing a good job with that? Because I'm seeing that crime is up, violent crime is up, homicides are up, police funding is down, police recruitment is down. So is it working?
Every day, we approach any vexing issue in our city, crime being among them, police recruitment being
Madam
among
Mayor, my time is up, but you know exactly what you need to make Washington, D.C. safer. You know that you need more police officers. You know that you need more
heard me
funding.
say
You know
that.
that you need policies that allow law-abiding
And you heard me say that.
citizens, thank you, ma'am, it's my time, law-abiding citizens to be able to protect themselves in their own home and defend them.
Ms.
You
Bobart,
know
it sounds
and
like
you wanted
you
to be a
heard
part
my
of the
opening
culture
statement.
war of the BLM 2020
Yeah.
riots
It
rather than
sounds like
protecting
you
and
heard
defending
my
the police
opening
and the
statement.
citizens in Washington,
And
D.C.
you're repeating it.
And my time has expired.
And I'm
Thank you,
happy
Madam
to
Mayor.
repeat it as well. And what we have said, Mr. Chairman, if you would permit me, in that I was overtalked much of that 5 minutes, is that we have been very focused on how to make sure we have a policy environment that supports a safe city, but also that we approach it not just with law enforcement, but with opportunities and with prevention.
Your policies are clearly making your city more dangerous, not safer.
And ladies' time has expired. Chair recognizes Mr. Goldman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mayor Bowser and Chief Contee, if you'd like to answer, is it helpful or hurtful to police recruitment when police officers are randomly shot and killed around the country?
Chief.
I don't think that that's necessarily helpful to police recruiting.
I didn't think so.
Yeah.
You know, this is National Police Week this week, and in that vein, I would like to recognize Chief Contee for your many years of service at the MPD, and good luck in your new role with the FBI. And we also owe you a huge debt of gratitude, as well as Mayor Bowser, but for the heroic efforts that you and your officers played in defending this Capitol on January 6th. It is particularly odd to me to hear my Republican colleagues talk so much this week about backing the blue when they also defend so many of the January 6th defendants who violently attacked the Capitol Police and MPD and injured nearly 150 officers, including causing 5 to die. And it is particularly rich hearing accusations from my Republican colleagues that anyone is soft on crime, considering the fact that a number of them have been to the D.C. jail to defend those violent criminals. We are now 5 months into this Congress. We have had, this is the 9th full hearing of this committee. This is the 2nd of 9 on Washington, D.C. That is nearly a quarter of this committee's time has been spent on a city of approximately 700,000 people. And I get it. Maybe it's because the chairman is actually able to find witnesses from the Washington, D.C. government. But this is a waste of time. Chief Contee, Mr. Timmons earlier said that he believes that the morale of the MPD is down. Is it helpful or harmful to the morale of the MPD for politicians to go to the D.C. jail to defend defendants charged with committing acts of violence against the MPD?
I think politicizing policing in any way is not helpful. You know, I won't specifically address the issue of go to a jail or not go to a jail, but any time politics is injected into law enforcement, I think that that is harmful to what our mission is.
And there's been a lot of discussion about violent crime in the city. What percentage of the violent crime in the city, in your estimate, Chief Contee, involves guns?
So there's a significant percentage of it that involves firearms. We see that. But I think, again, when you talk about crime in the city, I mean, I've heard a lot of numbers, you know, kind of thrown around in the city. I don't think there's anybody in this room that has been on more crime scenes than I have. So, you know, when we look at it, gun crime is certainly an issue. In the guns in the hands of individuals who should not have them in our city, that certainly is something that we've seen that has increased over the years.
To your knowledge, are any guns manufactured in Washington, D.C.?
There are some personally manufactured firearms, ghost guns, that people are able to assemble. But aside from that, there are no manufacturing places in Washington, D.C. for firearms.
So that means that all the firearms that are used in crimes in Washington, D.C. come from other states where they are permitted to be manufactured and sold. Is that right?
So the majority of the firearms that come into the District of Columbia, we are a consumer state much like New York City and other states, but Washington, D.C., the majority of the guns come from Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, from the south up to Washington, D.C.
States with much more lax gun laws than Washington, D.C., right?
Whatever the gun laws are there, those firearms show up in Washington, D.C.
Mr. Graves, I'm going to turn to you because you've been attacked repeatedly during this hearing about this number of 67%, and no one has given you a chance to respond. So with the rest of my time, I'd like for you to give whatever response you think appropriate.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So again, I cannot stress enough, throughout the whole time period that we've been looking at, the chart that was put up, 90% of serious violent felonies were charged at the time of arrest. And I would note, just because a case is not charged at the time of arrest does not mean that it's not ultimately charged, because there's often, particularly with our violent crimes, continued investigation that gets us in a position where we can charge the case. What we are seeing reflected in the data, which is an accurate snapshot of what the office was doing around the time I came into the office, was a 5-year trend that spans 3 administrations and 5 U.S. attorneys, primarily around the issue of misdemeanors and complications with prosecuting misdemeanors that we are trying to address, and we have started to address, and our papering rates, our charging rates in this year are much higher than what we saw last year.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Palmer from Alabama for 5 minutes.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you holding this hearing and trying to address a very serious issue. It has turned into another partisan debate, which is disappointing, but I do want to respond to a point that was made earlier about the taxes paid by the District of Columbia relative to Alabama and your state of Kentucky. I just want to point out that the median household income in the District of Columbia is 74% higher than it is in Alabama and Kentucky, yet the household poverty rate is higher in the District of Columbia than it is in Alabama and Kentucky. So you just need, things need to be put in perspective. Chief Contee, you've made the point repeatedly that most of the gun violence in the District of Columbia is committed with illegally possessed firearms. Is that correct?
That is correct, sir.
So the District of Columbia has very strict gun control laws. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Could you, short of banning all firearms in every state and in Mexico and Canada, can you explain to me how passing another law will reduce gun violence? And I really don't believe in gun violence. I think my colleague, Mr. Higgins from Louisiana, addressed that very intelligently and forthrightly, that there is no such thing as gun violence. It's only human violence. But most of the guns are already illegal. Is that correct?
That is correct. We have a number of legal firearms actually registered to district residents, over 34,000 legally registered firearms here in the District of Columbia. The ones that I see, the ones that show up generally on crime scenes, are handguns that are illegal firearms in possession of people who should not have them.
And law-abiding residents of the District of Columbia find it very, very difficult to get a concealed carry permit.
I would not agree with that. Like I said, I mean, we've issued over 34,000
out of a population
of those who want to have concealed carry permits. We process them. We have a time frame that we're allotted by law to do that, and generally that turnaround is roughly within 90 days.
But most of the crime committed in the District of Columbia is not committed by those people with concealed carry.
Most of it, no, sir.
Yes, sir. Thank you for that.
Yes, sir.
That response. Was the knife that was used to attack Senator Rand Paul's staffer a legal weapon, legally possessed weapon?
You said, was it illegal or illegal? I'm sorry.
Was it an illegal weapon?
If the blade was longer than 3 inches, then yes, it would have been an illegal weapon. Yes, sir.
But we don't have the same concern about those type weapons. And the fact of the matter is, and I haven't looked at the FBI's homicide statistics in a while, but there's more people killed with a bladed instrument or a blunt instrument or personal weapons like hands and feet by a significant number than are killed with a rifle of any type. Are you familiar with those statistics?
That's not the case in the District of Columbia, sir.
With rifles or handguns?
With handguns primarily, and now we're seeing, we're also seeing the weapons that have been converted to fully automatic. We're also seeing those show up, significant amount that are showing up on the streets.
Are those handguns that are being converted to fully automatic, or are there
some of them
guns?
are. Some of them are the ghost guns, AR-15 type, but we see all different types. Primarily firearms in the District of Columbia is the leading weapon.
And all of those are already illegal, is that correct?
That is correct, sir.
So again, Mr. Chairman, I think my earlier point is these hearings become partisan crap shows. I hate to say that. And we're not helping the District of Columbia, we're not helping our own states by having a rational discussion behind what's really driving crime in our country. And we've got to get serious about this. We make guns a political issue, we make income, I mean, we just come up with ways to really excuse ourselves from the real issue of what's driving crime in the country. I think we need to get more serious about it, and just gun control laws by themselves is not going to accomplish that. Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding the hearing. I yield back.
Very good point. Agree completely. Chair recognizes Ms. Stansberry from New Mexico for 5 minutes.
All right, well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to just start out by thanking Madam Mayor, Chief Contee, our others who are serving on the panel, and to just acknowledge your service on behalf of our capital city. And also, I see a lot of very proud staff sitting behind you. Thank you for serving the people of DC. Thank you for serving our nation's capital. And I want to say that, for one, I am deeply proud to be able to spend part of my time in this city. I lived lived here for 7 years when I was a staffer at OMB in the Senate, and I know the work that you guys put in every single day to make sure that our city is well represented, that we're caring for its citizens. And I find it ironic, which I think many of my colleagues have already touched on, that my colleagues across the aisle feel comfortable hauling all of these amazing public servants into our nation's capital to lecture you on your jobs, but they don't feel comfortable actually supporting the citizens of DC to actually have a right in this voting body. But I also find it ironic, and I want to also echo and give snaps to my colleague, Jasmine Crockett, who pointed this out, that we're here talking about crime while one of our colleagues from across the aisle, who's been indicted on 13 criminal counts, is not only at large after being bailed out of a New York jail, he is walking around this Capitol voting, and the people of DC do not have representation in these halls. It's outrageous. It is absolutely outrageous. I also find it ironic that we've seen such a dystopian view painted of this city over the last several hours. As somebody who's lived in this city, I came here when I was a kid. Today I was walking past the Capitol steps and I saw a bunch of kids on their 8th grade trips. And I was thinking about how much this city has transformed over the last several decades. And that is because of the policies Madam Mayor and you and others who are sitting here today have put into place. The social programs, universal pre-K, investments in infrastructure. This city has literally been transformed under your leadership for good. People have come back to the city. Young people want to live in this city. So I'm proud of the work that you all are doing, and I want to provide the opportunity because I've heard a lot of outrageous lecturing, a lot of misinformation, and the kind of usual partisan chaos that we hear in these hearings, to give you some time to talk about the things that you care about, things that you feel Congress can do to help support the city, and to address any issues that you feel need to be addressed this morning.
Thank you so much for that, Congresswoman. And I was kind of having the same reaction. While as mayor, you don't want to see any crime in your city, you definitely don't want to see increasing crime. I know that we have the tools that we need to drive it down. And while at the same time we're doing that, we haven't given up on the agenda that advances our city. Earlier in this year, I released our 5-year economic development strategy that is focused on our comeback and how we do that. We focus on our downtown for sure, but also on all of the wonderful neighborhood corridors all around our city that are thriving. Thank you for mentioning our children and the investments that we've made over the last 15 years in our school, which actually are attracting and keeping families in Washington, D.C. We're equally proud to have the #1 park system in the country, and that people in Washington, everyone lives less than 1 mile from a recreation center or park. Those are the things that we continue to invest in Washington, D.C. The Congress can be our partner in that we're unique, in that there's a lot of federal presence in our city, untaxable federal presence in our city, and the landscape of some of the federal leases and buildings is also changing. We have a great example of a partnership right in the center of Washington, and the Congresswoman, of course, has helped advance the discussions around Franklin Park, where we use local dollars to invest in an underutilized park that is now the center of our downtown. We've done that at the Wharf. We could do it at, we're doing it now at Walter Reed, St. Elizabeth's, and we know that we can focus on underutilized parcels elsewhere.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And I just want to add quickly on universal early childhood education. We actually are fortunate in New Mexico, in my home state, to have taken the advisor from the district who helped to create the first universal child care program in the country at the state level based on DC's model, because it's been so successful.
It's been amazing. Thank you.
So I want to thank you for your service, and I want to thank all of you who are here today for everything you do for our city.
Thank you.
Yield back.
Gentlelady yield. Chair recognizes Ms. Green from Georgia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we should all refresh our memories today and remember history. And who has caused the political violence here in Washington, D.C. by remembering how many times D.C. Metro Police were deployed for dangerous riots? In 2020, where Antifa and BLM rioters violently raged continuously, even nearly burning down the city, hundreds of police officers were injured, and rioters destroyed millions of dollars in property. Riots went to such extreme levels in Lafayette Park that Secret Service forced President Trump into the White House bunker. But all of the extreme left-wing violence didn't just start in 2020. No, it started in 2017 on President Trump's inauguration day. But all you hear about is a 3-hour riot on one single day, January 6, 2021. So let's talk about violent criminals and justice. Chief Contee, you've said what we've got to do if we really want to see homicides go down is keep bad guys with guns in jail. When they are in jail, they can't be in communities shooting people. Keep violent people in jail. Is that right, yes or no?
Yes.
Thank you. Mayor Bowser, do you agree with Chief Contee? Yes or no?
Yes, until people serve their sentences.
Yes, you agree they should stay in jail. Thank you very much, Mayor. Mr. Graves, you are the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia. You have the unique ability to prosecute both local and federal cases. However, Mr. Graves, your office has declined to prosecute 67% of those arrested in 2022, which means they can't stay in jail like Chief Contee is demanding after his police officers do the hard work of arresting these criminals. Instead, you are solely focused on prosecuting January 6 cases from one single day in our history. Meanwhile, D.C. crime is up. Total crime is up 27% from last year. Carjacking up 114%. Murders up 11%. Sexual abuse is up 45%. Property crime is up 30%. And just yesterday morning, a little innocent 12-year-old girl was shot while sleeping in her own bed by another rampant, violent criminal who has probably been previously arrested and not prosecuted. What do you think a resident in Anacostia is more afraid of? Their child catching a stray bullet on Monday, or a grandma walking through the Capitol more than 2 years ago? Mr. Graves, your decision to not prosecute 67% of the crimes in D.C. is absolutely criminal itself. People who were charged with murder have been arrested on average 11 times before because you refuse to keep them in jail like Chief Contee is demanding. You have already abused your position by maliciously prosecuting at least 1,000 people from January 6th, but you recently announced that you're going to arrest at least 1,000 more. Let me remind everyone the manner in which you go about your January 6th prosecutions. A man named Matthew Perna, who had no criminal record, peacefully entered the Capitol through an open door on January 6th. He stayed inside roughly 20 minutes. He didn't assault anyone, not a police officer, anyone. He didn't damage any property. He fully cooperated with the FBI and eventually pled guilty to all charges. But right before his sentencing, you, Mr. Graves, asked the judge for more time to object to the pre-sentence report, by the way, while you weren't prosecuting many of the crimes in D.C. This was so that you could ask for at least a few more years in prison for the guy that walked around in the Capitol for 20 minutes, not assaulting anyone. And this is what you've done repeatedly, over and over, for those who've pled or have been convicted on January 6th. Well, 2 weeks later, Matthew Perna hung himself in his garage. Mr. Graves, he was 37 years old. On March 9th, 2022, you dropped the case against Matthew Perna because he was dead. The time for weaponizing the Department of Justice needs to come to an end. And because you refuse to prosecute real criminals that are violating all the crimes here in Washington, D.C., and you want to talk about D.C. residents, they are victims of your abuse of power. And because of that, I am introducing articles of impeachment on you, Mr. Graves, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Before we recognize Ms. Mace for 5 minutes, I request unanimous consent for the representative from Georgia, Mr. Clyde, to be waived onto the committee for purpose of questioning without objection to order. Chair recognizes Ms. Mace for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our witnesses for being with us today. And crime is rampant in our nation's capital. It's rampant and out of control, like many other cities in the United States. During COVID and now after, crime is up significantly. In D.C., I read that homicides were up by 9% since last year. In fact, there have been more homicides in the first 120 days of 2023 than in the same period of any year in the past decade. We're starting summer, so tourism's going to be up. Violent crime consistently peaks from around the country this time of year as well. And at the same time, the D.C. police force has lost a net of 450 officers over the last 3 years, or almost 15% of the workforce. Mayor Bowser, I do want to recognize what you've done to give bonuses and try to hire police officers to the force. I myself have been a victim of some crime here in D.C., not once but twice now since I've come up here. And, we see this kind of thing around the country, and it's very important that we address it. And we can only leave to the imagination the kind of impression that the rampant crime that's up here in D.C. leaves on the country, to folks who come here from around the country and around the world to see the United States Capitol. We have foreign dignitaries, we have tourists, and we want to project strength and peace and safety for folks who are out here. D.C.'s out-of-control crime must be taken seriously and must be addressed as swiftly as we can. My first question today goes to Mr. Graves, and I have a few yes or no questions. Mr. Graves, do you think the D.C. Council's crime bill that I voted to override in this chamber would have led to an increased officer retention and hiring? Yes or no?
Increased officer retention or hiring is the question?
Yes. Would it have led to better officer retention and hiring? Yes or no?
I'm not sure it would have impacted one way or another. I don't know.
Yes or no, do you think the public should be aware of the crime happening around their neighborhoods and take it seriously?
So we are very much focused on community safety. Part of our community safety
Do you
strategy
think,
is
yes
making
or no,
sure
the public should be aware? The question was, public should be aware of crime happening in their neighborhoods?
Yes.
Okay. So you agree, it's a good thing when a citizen reports something they saw, like see something, say something?
Yes.
Yes.
Generally want law enforcement or our community members to report crime of which they're aware.
Right. So a couple of days ago at the DC Safety Summit, you said just going out there and kind of fear-mongering and making broad claims that aren't born out of data is not helpful, and I think we unfortunately see that from non-traditional media sometimes. So yes or no, do you think having this hearing today is fear-mongering in DC?
So I appreciate
Yes
the
or no,
opportunity.
do you think that this hearing is fear-mongering in DC based on your comments from a few days ago?
So it's not
Yes
a yes or
or
no. It's
no?
not a
Is
yes
this
or no.
an I don't
I
know?
can answer your question, Congresswoman, but it's not a yes or no question.
It is. I asked it. Yes or no, do you believe it's the job of a prosecutor to represent the government and to prosecute crimes on its behalf?
Yes.
Interesting. So then why are you bringing only a third of the cases brought to you? Why is the DC Police Chief Contee literally calling bullshit on your excuses for not prosecuting 67% of arrests? Was he fear-mongering?
So
Is your chief of police fear-mongering when he calls BS on your prosecution?
of course our chief of police is not fear-mongering, but I think you're taking quotes out of context, and if I could provide the context, I'd be happy to
No,
explain.
I'm not interested in that. I'm using your words directly verbatim from you. I want to finish with this afternoon. D.C. is a lot like Charleston. It's a city that has a lot of charm. It's a city by which many Americans judge our country. We have a high rate of tourism in Charleston, South Carolina. And Charleston takes its crime seriously and has built a community that many want to visit, many want to join, just like Washington, D.C. But the same cannot be said of D.C., which saddens many of us here today. And I want to recognize Mayor again for your efforts with your police force to add more police. More needs to be done, and I'm sure that you recognize that as well. Thank you, and I yield back.
Lady yields back.
Mr. Chairman, is it possible for me to respond to tourism issues?
Go ahead, briefly,
Yeah,
please.
so it's been mentioned by a few members concerned about tourists, and tourism is not about fun and games in DC. It is a real part of our bottom line, and welcoming visitors to our city allows us to make the types of investments that we're proud of. We are very proud that we are rebounding from pre-COVID in the number of people visiting the District of Columbia from around our region, from around the country, and increasingly international travel is up. And we know with better visa management, we'll see even more travelers coming from around the world. So people shouldn't be concerned about our tourism numbers. They're on the rise. We remain concerned about business travel, so we want everybody who wants to come and call on the Congress about this issue or that to visit Washington, D.C. to do that as well.
Good to hear. Chair recognizes Mr. Donalds from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry. Mayor Bowser, good to see you. Chief Contee, it's been a while. You haven't been back for 2 years or so. It's good to see you. Mr. Donahue, first time. Mr. Graves, bro, you need to do your job. I mean, let's just be very clear. You know, obviously, you have a responsibility to the residents of the district in a myriad of ways. I think, you know, my colleague talked about that and went in some heavy detail there. But if you're not going to do the job of actually standing behind Chief Contee and the work that his men and women do with the Metropolitan Police Department, then you're selling them down the river, and with them, the residents of D.C., and even the tourists that come to D.C. But, you know, they're the ones that live here. They, you know, they ride the bus, they get on the metro, they're going to school, they're going to work, and what everybody wants is just to be safe. And you're not holding up your end of the bargain. I've seen MPD all over DC. They're out here every single day. It's not, they are here. It's very clear when they're on the scene. But you're not doing your job. So I just find it to be disgusting, frankly. Just uphold the law, enforce the law. And that actually will make the job easier for the chief and for the mayor to do their jobs. Mayor Bowser, real quick, you know, when the Oversight Committee was investigating January 6th, you were not here. I don't know what was going on, so no need to go down that road. But I really had a question about, you requested troops on you addressed National Guard troops on December 31, 2020, is that correct?
That sounds right, but I would want to confirm the dates.
That's fine.
Yep.
That's fine. That's fine. Based upon any recollection that you have, what was the rationale for requesting National Guard troops?
We wanted to make sure that our city blocks were protected, and the chief decided, we were in that transition week, so the chiefs decided that we wanted to create a traffic box around certain parts of our downtown. And the best use of resources would be National Guard instead of MPD, so that MPD could be available for law enforcement. So that was our request.
Okay, so quick follow-up to that, because, you know, I remember it, having gone through orientation here before I got sworn in as a member of Congress, that during that time period, you know, to the pandemic and everything else, there was no traffic in DC, not like it is today. Like, nobody was driving through the streets of DC during that time period. So, like, and this is a legitimate question, was the concerns purely traffic corridors in the district for the date of January 6th?
Let me ask the chief to talk about how we
Sure, Chief Contee, if you can, that'd be great.
Yeah, so traffic is part of the concern. You know, certainly when we create traffic boxes and you know we're expecting a lot of people in our city, we don't want to mix people and cars. So creating that space where for people who are expressing their First Amendment rights could peacefully be in the street or on the sidewalk or whatever, and not be hindered by cars and buses moving about.
Well, Chief, I just want to reclaim my time. I'm a minute 28. That's no disrespect to what you're saying. And my coughing, no disrespect to either.
No worries.
So real quick, now in a letter that was sent on January 5th, Mayor Bowser, you stated that the National Guard, that you were accepting the support, but you wanted them to be in an unarmed capacity. Is that correct? Or Chief Contee, can you corroborate that? Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So, and I thank you for that. These are some of the things that we just want to clarify. And I think here's the overarching point. And to be frank, honestly, Mayor Bowser, this really ain't got nothing to do with you. I think this is just a general point of what happened, when, and why. And I think, actually, last question for you. When your request for National Guard troops were, obviously, they were answered and you were given whatever you needed. Is that correct?
We were given, I believe, some of what we requested.
Okay. Were there any limits that came from the Secretary of the Army?
Yes.
Okay. Can anybody stipulate what that was?
Yeah, a couple of things. So we wanted, well, first of all, the limitation was we could not change their assignments without first receiving approval from the Secretary of the Army. We could not move National Guard members anywhere east of 9th Street Northwest. We couldn't move them there. And another thing we wanted was a quick reaction force, members of the National Guard to be able to respond. I don't think we received that resource either.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
All right. Last point I'll make, Mr. Chairman, and I know I'm slightly over my time. One thing that was clear in previous testimony in this committee, corroborated by this testimony today, is that, troops from National Guard were authorized by the president at the time, Donald Trump, on January 4. They were authorized. It was testified in this committee they were authorized. DC was able to take advantage of them in the capacity that DC wanted to save for the couple of requests that you also wanted. One thing that's important to indicate, Mr. Chairman, is that for National Guard troops to be deployed to the Capitol, it requires the Capitol Police Board to actually issue a state of emergency for troops to come on Capitol grounds. And the police board is made up of the architect of the Capitol, the head of Senate security, the head of House security, and the chief of the Capitol Police. And by my understanding, 3 of those 4 people report to the Speaker of the House. And the Speaker of the House at that time was Nancy Pelosi. So when we want to talk about National Guard being here and the timetable of them getting here, it's important to understand that there were National Guard in the District of Columbia, and their limitation of coming to the Capitol was not due to anybody else, because the president is not authorized to deploy troops to the Capitol, separation of powers. It is at the hands of the Speaker of the House. And with that, I yield, and I apologize for being 1:24 over.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Session from Texas for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And Mr. Comer, Chairman Comer, I want to thank you for your not only meeting with at least Republicans before this hearing, but expressing your confidence that you believe that we could have a thoughtful meeting today with the representatives that would be here, and that the words of confidence that you spoke with the mayor about her job and how this committee could thoughtfully have a conversation today. It's my hope we will continue to have that conversation. I recognize you've been here a number of hours, each of you, and thank you. Some of the points that we've heard is that people on our side, where Republicans don't care about Washington, D.C., that we don't take time to come and walk the streets and talk to people. Well, perhaps there could be some evidence of that, but also my parents for over 20 years lived here, and my mother and my father both engaged Washington, D.C. elected officials, and I believe tried to provide feedback, and they did to my parents, and I was a part of those conversations. And I would like to say that there is great confidence that we want to have in working with you, and I think that's evidenced by you being here today. Mayor, I serve as the subcommittee chairman for government operations, and we have been in discussions and intend to have conversations with the federal government about bringing people back to work. I don't need to go through the facts of the case today, but the bottom line is the federal government is lagging, in our opinion, of getting people back to work. Back to work is, I think, not just healthy, but we have so many problems with passports and government, the IRS, and a lot of other agencies in performance of their duties that are necessary to the American people, so we will be doing that. I want to just perhaps provide some context, we have just come off being in the minority for 4 years. We had an opportunity when we were in the minority to help work and craft. Our colleagues sometimes led us and sometimes shared, sometimes did not share so well. But the agenda was definitely on the side of the Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, and those who would be chairman of the committees. Their agenda is virtually our agenda today. That is that we're trying to make sure that the city of Washington, D.C. has a relationship with us whereby we provide feedback and we try and look at the things that are done. Together, we do recognize running a city is hard. We do recognize, however, or believe that just like the bipartisan piece of legislation that we did where we disagreed with the D.C. City Council could not have come at a worse time based upon the assault on one of our members. And that created an era of lawlessness in this city. Please know this, we would like to work with you. However, we'd like for you to have an equal knowledge that marijuana in its simplest form is an addictive problem. And your members, D.C. members, and your people who are in your police force and others should recognize that there are things being mixed in marijuana, there are hallucinogens, there are problems that we have, and you're going to keep having violent crime if you keep having the positions that you take on allowing marijuana to be openly smoked, because it is easily infiltrated, so to speak. It can be changed, but it all by itself is an addictive, dangerous product, and there is more than enough national information out here. It creates a psychosis. It creates a lot of real problems. Who are the losers in this? Women and children. Women and children get the brunt of this problem, and I would like to just face all four of you and say, you need to tell the truth. You need to tell people the truth because they know it, and you will keep being a drug haven, a crime haven, and a gun haven if you continue how you approach drugs in the city of Washington, D.C. I'm very open to allowing you, you don't have to do it this forum, but that engagement, and expect it to come from the Government Operations Subcommittee, the engagement on public safety and the safety of women and children. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for the time. I know I'm over. My special thanks to all four of you for taking time to respectfully, thoughtfully take time to articulate your ideas with a group of people who care about you. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Clyde for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Comer, for letting me participate today. I greatly appreciate this opportunity. Mayor Bowser, you vetoed the revised Criminal Code Act passed by the D.C. City Council, correct?
Correct.
All right. And I assume it was because you disagreed with several of the soft-on-crime provisions that the D.C. Council included in the legislation. Is that correct?
I outlined my objections,
Okay.
and I also submitted an amendment that would address my objection to the D.C. Council.
Okay, thank you. As I recall, you stated that the revised Criminal Code Act, and I quote, does not make us safer. And I have to say that I agree with you. And I'm pleased that Congress passed my resolution, H.J. Res. 26, to nullify that misguided bill. And I'm grateful that with President Biden's signature, we prevented the radical RCCA from becoming law. Mayor Bowser, I noticed that you did not veto the Comprehensive Policing and Justice Reform Emergency Amendment Act, but you did not sign it either, correct?
That's correct.
All right. So, so as I understand it, the police reform, and let's call it that, legislation moved forward without your signature.
That's correct.
All right. So why did you not sign it or veto it?
I did not sign it because I knew that we would have to revisit some of the provisions with the council. I've been mayor 8 years. I think I've vetoed 8 bills. So there may be in all of the legislation that has gone through and I have signed or not signed in those years, things that I agree with or things that I don't. I sometimes will leave my signature off if I know that I'm going to have to revisit a provision with the council.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, you know, I think that maybe the folks of this city and those of us who actually do vote don't find it acceptable that you don't take a stand on what a piece of legislation says. You don't approve it, you don't disapprove it. You just let it. Let me finish.
No, exactly.
Let me finish.
Mm-hmm.
So earlier in this hearing, Mayor Bowser, you said that there is no greater supporter of the Metro Police Department than you. And so by not signing this bill or not vetoing it, you consider yourself the greatest supporter of the Metro Police Department. Chief Contee, would you agree with that statement, that the mayor is the greatest supporter, no greater supporter in the city than the mayor?
I've been dealing with this mayor for the last 8 years that she's been mayor, and she is a great supporter of our law enforcement officers.
Okay, well, I think that's a pretty low bar, Chief. Now, Attorney Graves, United States Attorney Graves, question for you, sir. Representative Mace said earlier, she asked the question, should communities be made aware of the crime in their neighborhood? And you said yes, affirmatively. Am I correct?
Yes, we believe in transparency.
Great. Oh, I agree with you. All right, in 2016, the Department of Justice provided Senator Grassley with criminal prosecution data from 2010 to 2015. This is the actual letter right here. And it says, in response to your request for the data regarding arrests for offenses of homicide, rape, robbery, aggravated assault, burglary, larceny, motor vehicle theft, and arson, we have provided the data for the D.C. Code offenses that best corresponds to your request. So will you commit here today to providing the prosecution statistics exactly as you did to Senator Grassley to this committee for the last 7 years, 2016 through 2020?
So I'm generally familiar with the letter, but it actually was issued at a time when I wasn't in the office.
That's fine.
I can tell you what we're planning on doing is...
Well, I mean, you can do this, right? I mean, you have the statistics to do it. Are you willing to do it? I want to see the criminal statistics, the prosecution statistics from 2016 through 2022. Will you provide it?
I understand the question. I want to explain what we're planning on doing. So the challenge that our office has historically faced is a lot of this data isn't readily available because of our antiquated systems. So we've had to manually pull the information. I have hired a data scientist so that we can more effectively do it. We are going to start monthly publishing of our prosecutorial statistics.
Okay, so you will go back. You will go back to 2016 through 2022 and provide it to this committee.
So we're going to do it real time going forward.
Great, fantastic. But will you do it for 2016 through 2022? That's my question to you.
So
yes or no would suffice.
I want to see the data, and look, these are trade-offs. If we're going to go back and do this as historical analysis that we have to do by hand, I have to take people away from current prosecutions in order to do a historical analysis. I'm focused on where the numbers are because that informs me on prosecutorial strategy.
It also tells us where you are and how successful you have been or what you decide to do or not to do when it comes to prosecutions. Will you provide this information to the committee?
So, of course, we are happy to look into the request if we can review the letter and see what we can pull together.
Happy to provide you a copy of the letter.
Thank you.
And you will provide us the statistics.
Chair Gnazek.
Thank you.
Gentlemen, time's expired, and did you feel free to answer the question?
So we, of course, want to provide any information to the committee that would be helpful to it in its oversight exercises.
Thank you. I yield back.
That concludes our questioning portion. Now I yield to the ranking member for brief closing remarks.
Thank you kindly, Mr. Chairman. Mayor Bowser, thank you. Chief Contee, U.S. Attorney Graves, Mr. Donahue, and I want to thank so many residents of Washington, D.C. who've turned out today, and thank them for their democratic patience as they await approval of their petition for statehood. And I see that one of the statehood senators for the District of Columbia is here, Paul Strauss, and I want to thank him for being here. Mr. Chairman, if this hearing was about governance, then everything that I heard from the witnesses argues for statehood, which is how we put people on a plane of equality and political self-government in America. And so statehood is an imperative of basic democratic values, but also of governmental efficiency. And we've heard a lot of criticism today of the Department of Justice and the U.S. Attorney's Office. I haven't heard much about the D.C. government. The people of Washington, D.C. don't control their own judges. They don't elect judges the way lots of people do in different states and jurisdictions. They don't elect the prosecutors who prosecute felony crimes. So much of the questioning was about that. That's going to a federal official. And without regard to the merits of those particular complaints, they just don't relate to the people of D.C. But if D.C. became a state, as they're seeking to do, like 37 other states have done, have been admitted since the founding of the Republic, then they would be completely responsible for the crime situation, the prisons, prosecution, and so on, except for those things, that minority of crimes that are prosecuted by the U.S. Attorney. But if this was a hearing about crime, then what I've heard from multiple people is that it shouldn't just focus on one city. It should focus on all the cities and towns in all of the states of America. And that means that we have to confront gun violence, which is in fact a crime. Yes, if you want to be tough on crime, then you've got to be tough on gun violence. If you want to be soft on gun violence, then you're soft on crime, because we're losing thousands of our people every year to the nightmare of gun violence, which is now causing foreign governments to issue travel advisory warnings for people to come to the United States, saying that we have a gun violence problem that is dangerous. The statehood petition, which Congresswoman Norton has introduced, makes all the sense in the world. It has Congress using our power under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, the district clause power, to modify the boundaries of the federal district. Congress did that in 1846, right before the Civil War, apparently, according to historians, at the behest of slave masters in Virginia who were nervous that slavery was going to be abolished in the District of Columbia, the slave traffic. And in fact, they were right about that. And you know who was the person pushing for the abolition of the slave traffic in the District of Columbia? It was the founder of the chairman's party, Abraham Lincoln. In his single term in the House of Representatives, that was the main thing he was doing, trying to abolish slavery in the nation's capital. But the slave masters of Virginia, they feared it, and they got Congress to retrocede all of the land in Alexandria, Arlington, and Fairfax County back to the Commonwealth of Virginia, which established precisely the precedent that's being invoked here, which is Congress has the power to modify the boundaries of the federal district. And if we had the power to do it in the 19th century to protect the slave masters, certainly we have the power to do it in the 21st century to vindicate the democratic rights of the people of Washington, D.C. That's the real historical imperative here, and we should work on crime as a national problem. I want to thank the mayor and the chief for everything that they are doing in Washington, and the U.S. Attorney for everything they're doing in D.C. There are things that the other states can learn from D.C., and certainly things that D.C. can learn from the other states. But crime should never be an opportunity to demonize and vilify a whole population of American citizens and their leadership. But I think the mayor, you have led a very distinguished team of officials here and acquitted yourself beautifully in explaining all of the great progress that's been happening in Washington, not just in terms of crime, but in terms of other public policies too. So thank you for coming, and thank you once again for rising to the defense of the Union and the Republic on January 6th. And we absolutely need to give the District of Columbia power over its National Guard. We would have been a lot safer had you been deploying the National Guard when you deployed the Metropolitan Police Department 3 hours before the President of the United States did. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back, and again, I want to thank the witnesses for being here. I think this was a very substantive committee hearing. Mayor, as I said in our earlier meeting, I pledge to work with you. The majority on this committee wants to work with you. We want to see Washington, D.C. grow, prosper, and be one of the safest cities on the planet. This committee has a history of Republican chairs working with Democrat mayors for the betterment of Washington, D.C. You go back to Tom Davis when he was chairman of this committee, Jason Chaffetz, even Mark Meadows worked closely with Democrat mayors because, as I stated in our opener, this committee is tasked with jurisdiction over Washington, D.C. We all spend, I guess now, a majority of our time in Washington, D.C. For our jobs. So obviously we have a vested interest in seeing the Washington city grow and prosper and be safe. Chief, we want to thank you for your service. We appreciate the service of you and your colleagues, and we pledge to do whatever we can to help you be successful. And Mr. Graves, as you have heard criticism from this side of the aisle, crime is a priority for this committee. Crime is one of the issues that we campaigned on to flip the House, to take the House from Democrat majority to Republican majority. We're not satisfied with your job performance in Washington, D.C. We've seen the statistics, we've seen the data. It's just not, one of the problems with the crime in America is we have prosecutors who are behind or sympathetic or liberal or lazy or whatever, maybe even don't have the resources to effectively keep up with prosecutions. We've played the video before of the chief issuing a statement with a gaggle of reporters. Someone had been arrested over 10 times, I believe, and let out, and they're still on the street committing crimes. This is unacceptable. It's unacceptable in Washington, D.C. It's unacceptable in Louisville, Kentucky. It's unacceptable anywhere in America. So we hope that if there's something this committee can do to help increase the prosecutions in Washington, D.C., please let us know. We want to see that happen. And Mayor, just from listening to the committee, listening to your testimony, I know you said several things that caught my attention. The taxing of the marijuana, for example. I didn't know what the law was on that. We're researching that. I know that you have a lot of big issues coming forward, opportunities in Washington, D.C., a new arena. I know that would require some type of legislative assistance. That's something that we would pledge to work with you and your office on, something that I think would be beneficial to the city. Certainly legislation to help keep criminals in jail. We want to hold criminals accountable for wrongdoing. That's going to be a priority for this House majority, not just in Washington, D.C., as I said, but all over America. And lastly, the Show Up Act, which we supported. I was the primary sponsor. We had Democrat opposition to this bill, but I think, Mr. Donahue, this would help the whole city of Washington, D.C. You have a ripple effect of businesses that are suffering. I understand commercial real estate occupancy is down. It all pertains to the business model in downtown Washington and built around a bunch of federal employees showing up for work every day. We want to see those federal employees go back to work, Mayor. That's why we passed the Show Up Act and would welcome your active support with Senator Schumer in the Senate. So I think there's a great opportunity to work together, this committee and the mayor's office, the chief, the U.S. attorney, city administrator. We want to see that happen, and I look forward to that relationship moving forward. With that and without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit materials and to submit additional written questions for the witnesses, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. If there is no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.